My question is, why Russia, in your opinion, attacked the Ukraine now?
You mean why did Russia invade Ukraine?
Yes.
Russia invaded Ukraine because they did not want Ukraine to join NATO. They wanted Ukraine as a buffer state. A buffer state is basically a nation that separates what they consider nations of a potential enemy in the case of NATO, because NATO was formed, well, they say NATO was formed to protect what happened with Nazi Germany invading everything, but the truth is NATO was really technically formed because they were afraid of the Soviet Union.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is Russia in, the part of NATO, no?
No.
Oh.
Russia asked to join NATO in the 1950s because they initially wanted to try to I can't remember the name of the two advisors who advised, they initially advised Stalin, and when Stalin passed away, they advised his successor Gorbachev. And they did, Gorbachev was like, okay, we'll extend an olive branch, ask if we can join NATO. And NATO flat out refused and said no, and that's when basically the Soviet Union proved to the people that NATO was formed to combat what they considered the spread of communism, or in Russia's case with the Soviet Union, they considered them an enemy of them at that point. So in the Soviet
Union,
we
didn't agree to join
them. And because from that point on, every conflict that came from NATO and the United Nations was to combat the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine, Belarus, and a lot of these other nations became independent, as well as the Eastern Bloc.
So Russia wants to have Ukraine as a protector from a Union. If Union wants to attack?
No, what they want is for them not to go to NATO because they don't want a shared border with NATO. And the reason for this is that if they don't share a border, it means it's far more difficult for them to be directly invaded by land if there's ever a war.
Yes, by land.
That's the reason why Belarus has a government installed basically by Russia, even though they deny it, that is friendly to Russia, and they're wanting to do the same with Ukraine. So what's going to end up happening with this invasion, their plan is not to rule Ukraine, their plan is to put in a government that supports the Russian Federation and remains independent.
But what if NATO wants to invade Russia by air?
That's almost impossible. You always need troops on the ground. You need a ground force to push through. Even a sea force coming through the Black Sea would be extremely difficult. You can't move enough troops or ships through there, and it's basically a choke point where they can easily sink the ships and block off the access to the Black Sea. So they couldn't invade that way. It has to come over by land. In the case of Ukraine, a lot of it is flat plains. It's easy to roll tanks, troops, personnel through there, especially in the winter or summer months when it's not muddy.
So, other words, in case of the war, NATO and America should need to have buildings in Ukraine somewhere close to the borders to Russia to win war.
Yes, because you have what we call a supply chain or a supply line. A force projection, or how far your troops can advance, is based on how your supply line is built. You have to move supplies at the same rate that the troops advance forward. If you don't have the supplies that are able to move advance, your troops don't have fuel, they don't have food, they don't have ammunition. Without these things, you can't conduct a military campaign. By sea, that's difficult to do. Now, by sea, you can ship it over, but you need months of buildup to move an invasion through. There's a reason why the initial invasion of Russia to Ukraine was slow, because they had to do what we call forward operating base production, where they build a base to move their supplies closer to the front line so that they can supply their troops. That's why everyone was like, oh, Russia, they don't know what they're doing. No, we did the same thing. We invaded Iraq. We had to slowly push in, build forward centers to move the supplies up, and then we advance forward from it. That way we always can have resupply.
Did you win war with Iraq?
We did, but we were there. Okay, I say we did, but because it was an occupation, the moment we left, the country fell apart because we're the what was keeping it together.
Mhm.
In all honesty, Iraq is a very unique case because there are basically three major cultures that don't get along in one nation.
Mhm.
The Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds. They don't get along and they're all in the same nation. Saddam kept them in order by basically terrorizing them. Either you obey or you die, and they stopped fighting. But in
Interesting.
the case of certain countries with occupations, sometimes if they feel that you're a liberator, they're okay with you being there. If they consider you to be an invader, they attack you. Best example would be Afghanistan. When the Soviets came in, they attacked them. When we came in, they attacked us. They don't like anybody outside of their own culture being there, regardless if we're helping them or not. They want us out. They want to fight their own wars.
Okay, talking back about North Korea and China. So you said before that China didn't attack North Korea, but they still considered them enemy from the Second World War, right?
Well, what happened is, so the
Why
Second
they
World War,
didn't attack? Why China didn't attack North Korea?
because North Korea didn't exist at the time.
No, now.
Now, because China technically controls North Korea. They're a puppet state of China. The Chinese are the ones who installed the family that controls North Korea. What ended up happening is shortly after the Soviet Union took part of Korea when they were invading Japan, because Japan controlled that whole area. It was called Manchuria. And because Manchuria is like right up north of Korea, and they controlled this whole area when the Japanese invaded Korea and took that. They took it for oil, steel, other natural resources that they needed. So at the end of the war, we came to an armistice. The United States would put station troops on one half of it and the Soviet Union on the other half. Japan was completely controlled by the United States because Japan's required surrender was that they would surrender to the United States only out of fear of retribution from the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So we had an agreement with the United Nations that we would hold elections inside Korea for them to form their own government.
But you do you agree with me that North Korea is the crazy communist country?
Well, yes.
And they had the craziest politics and government there. So, can you repeat, please, what did you said to me before about people who's living there? They starving. You said why?
They're starving because their government spends about half of their entire gross domestic product on military. Now I mentioned they severely neglected their infrastructure, their farming, their actual equipment for it.
Why are they supporting their military? Because they don't want to be attacked by someone?
Yes, because they basically
afraid?
are technologically inferior and in training to South Korea. Up until about 1975, North Korea actually had a fighting chance against South Korea. South Korea was poorer than North Korea. North Korea had all the industry originally from the Japanese before they left. It had the steel production, it had the factories. South Korea was all farmland. And because of this, they were entirely dependent on support from the United States and Japan, because Japanese industry, because they were out of the United States, helped fund them. So once South Korea began to advance at a certain point, North Korea started spending more and more money on their military to basically out of fear that they would be invaded. And then in the 1990s, a major famine happened in North Korea, and the the United Nations basically sent food into them with food banks. But the people were starving so bad that they were literally told to go out into the fields and cut grass and boil the grass and eat it for food.
What about nowadays?
Some areas nowadays, they're still pretty bad. They'll tell them to scrape the bark off the trees, eat the grass. In 2008, some American journalists went to North Korea to take pictures and talk about them opening up to South Korea to allow tourism come in. And they told them to turn the camera away because there were a group of peasants out in the field cutting grass and putting it into a bag because that was how they were going to eat that day because they didn't have any food.
Crazy.
And it still happens. Like some North Korean defectors who were soldiers, go to South Korea, they talk about how only the elite troops in North Korea get full meals. The regular people, they might only eat once every 1 or 2 days, because most of the food that they get, the army takes for the troops. Only so much gets to go to the civilians, so they're usually trying to hide food in
Where
the farms.
did they have imported like products from in our countries or not?
No, we actually have embargoes against North Korea. The only thing that's allowed to come in is mostly food.
But what about Russia? Russia didn't provide them food.
Because of the the problem is that since we block all shipping for ships to go in there, except for particular ships, the only way to get anything through is with the shared border with China through trucks.
But why America had a problem with North Korea?
Because they invaded South Korea and started a war, and we're technically still at war with them.
Why China has a problem with North Korea?
China only has a problem with North Korea because they keep antagonizing South Korea, Japan, and the United States. China talks a lot of stuff about wanting to have a war, but they don't want a war. Most of their economy is in trade with the world. If a major war breaks out, China could go bankrupt in 6 months because all their trade gets cut off. Most of their money comes in from international trade. Not to mention, they are heavily dependent on imports of oil for their economy. If a major war breaks out, if they shut down their oil shipments for the ships coming out of the Middle East, they're screwed. They don't want a war for that reason. The only reason why, actually that's the main reason why they started building up the islands in the South China Sea, was that if a war does break out, they have a better chance of defending their shipping because they're going to be extremely vulnerable to air and sea attack taking on their oil tankers.
But what about, you said before that China, as I remember, kept North Korea as a protector country.
They kept them as a buffer state. So what happened is during the Korean War, North Korea pushed the United States and South Korea into a very small portion of South Korea called Busan, and we managed to push out all the way back to Seoul. And then MacArthur and a bunch of more divisions and Army Corps of troops came in, and we pushed North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border. Out of fear that we might overtake North Korea and invade China, China sent more than 300,000 soldiers to their border and counterattacked against us. They surprise attacked us.
Oh, that you're talking about the problem of war between China and USA.
Yes, back in 1951.
Yeah,
and
I was confusing when I asked that because I was wondering to know why China protect Taiwan. Or
no, the United States protects Taiwan.
Yes, the United States protects Taiwan from China.
Yes.
Because China wants to own of Taiwan.
Yes.
And that's why you guys both has a problem because Taiwan. Everybody wants to have Taiwan. I mean, not USA doesn't want to have Taiwan.
No, we have
we
a
want to
treaty
protect
with
them. Yeah.
The treaty was because they helped us fight the Japanese in World War II.
Yeah.
We helped them. We were trying to help them retake and rebuild China. We gave them tanks. We gave them supplies.
To whom?
To the White Party. That was the party that was that helped us. And then Mao Zedong went to Stalin. Joseph Stalin actually gave him a bunch of troops and supplies, and so he used those supplies to attack the White Party while they were vulnerable and pushed them all the way out of the country to Taiwan. We tried to help them fight it off, but the problem was that by the point that war had broke out, most of our troops had already gone home after the war. We were sick of fighting the Second World War. We didn't really want to get involved in another war right away.
Sure.
So they lost. And what ended up happening is we basically said, when we signed the peace treaty, that we would protect them on the island with threat of nuclear war against the Chinese if they ever tried to invade. Now, the Chinese have, in the past, there was a couple times where they fired artillery shells and rockets and stuff at Taiwan, and we counterattacked them.
Okay, so let's come back to our beginning of the conversation. Like, why Russia attacked Ukraine now? What was the reason of that? Is that like China wants to have Taiwan as a protector?
No, it's more like China with North Korea. They want a buffer state so that troops cannot be built up against their border. Because they already saw how quickly we made a push through North Korea and almost overtook the border during the Korean War.
So Russia wants to make Ukraine as a buffer state?
Yes, as a buffer state, just like Belarus is a buffer state on their other. They want Belarus and Ukraine here blocking Western Europe from their border.
I see.
Now, they do still have a shared border towards the Norwegian states, but they're not worried about there because it's very mountainous. It's hard to move troops over all those mountains. The reason why they're worried about the area with Ukraine and Belarus, it's all open land.
To NATO, to go to.
Yeah, it's all open plains. That's why Poland is so scared, because Poland is mostly open plains too. It's easy to move a large force of troops through it, like tanks, armed personnel carriers, supply trucks, trains.
And it's very dangerous for Poland.
That's why Poland is very terrified right now, because the last time this kind of conflict brewed up, they got invaded twice.
The Second World War?
Second World War, and before that too, during the Russo-Prussian War.
So, okay, but Russia didn't achieve what they want. I mean, they still continue.
Yes.
But I've heard about that Ukraine and NATO ready to join to Ukraine to them.
Yes, but if Russia wins the war, Ukraine can't join. They don't control it. That's the reason why they're fighting. If they take enough land and force them to terms, because they have two ways that Russia's attempting to win. Either A, take enough of the land of Ukraine that they can force them to a negotiation table and say, listen, we'll give this part of land back to you, but you can never join NATO, and you have to remain independent. You can't do business with certain things with them. And two, the other way is to take the government and overthrow them and install a new government. So there's also a third issue involved with Ukraine that's not really widely talked about, and that's the other real big reason why Russia didn't want Ukraine joining NATO is, like usual, involves oil. They found a huge reservoir of oil under Ukraine, that would threaten Russia's monopoly of their oil and pipeline that goes to the Western Europe that they make a lot of money off of.
So is it true that Russia provide oil to America?
Like 4%.
4%?
Yeah, most of what we got from Russia was fertilizer. Russia probably produced half of the world's fertilizer from their plants inside Russia. That's the main thing we were worried about.
So Russia now, Russian government, they terrified about that someone from NATO or from America wants to attack them. That's why
they're not truly terrified as much as they're worried about the influence of NATO with their citizens. See, if you share a border, it's real easy because the culture's right there next to each other. It's easy for them to influence. The best example would be East and West Germany. Even though that they were, part was communist, part was, on the other side, the communist bloc was always envious of the other side. They were always like sneaking over the border, bringing back stuff from the West. And eventually when the wall came down, they all ran to the side going, we want to be with them. That's what they're afraid of. Because if you try to control their social media, control what they can do, and the other side gives you complete freedom or more freedom, they're immediately always going to be envious of the side with more freedom and want to join their cause. But if you have a buffer state, they can't really interact as easily with that. So that's one of the reasons. The other one, and their greatest fear is, if Ukraine joins NATO, that means the United States, Britain, France, and others can station troops in the Ukraine. We have an agreement with NATO to do what we call cross-training exercises, where we basically have our troops and their troops trained together in case of that one of them's invaded. That means there will be United States troops in Ukraine against a border with Russia. Russia does not want that. And Russia's exact reasoning is the exact same reason why we didn't want Russia in Cuba with nuclear weapons or their troops there, because of how close they were with our nation, is the same reason that Russia doesn't want us inside the Ukraine. But there is a funny thing. We've had troops in Turkey for a long time. Also, we have nuclear weapons in Turkey, and they technically have a border shared with Russia. But the difference is Turkey remains neutral. They do not want any part of a war with Russia or the United States, and the United States troops were not allowed to be anywhere near the Russian border. We're kept near the Anatolia region, which is right at the Mediterranean.
I have a question, sorry, maybe it's a silly question, but what is it troops? I don't know.
Soldiers.
Soldiers?
Yes.
Okay. So, and the question is, the American, is it really that America wants to attack Russia one day?
No.
No, it's not
We've
true.
we've never won in a war with Russia because there's no winning a war with them. The moment we have troops go to war with each other is the moment mutually assured destruction occurs. We both have the two largest nuclear stockpiles in the world.
Yes.
If we have troops fight each other on the ground, nuclear weapons are going off. It's just going to happen.
Yeah. A Premier Minister of Russia, Lavrov, his surname, he made a quote like, "We are waiting of nuclear world, and this is will be. I promise you, the nuclear world, a war will be this time." But some days later, he made a new quote like, "We can make nuclear war. We against of this shit." Like, what the fuck?
Yeah, because there's no winning. No one wins in a nuclear war. Everyone suffers.
Everyone, yes.
And
The whole world can escape.
no, the whole world. If enough nuclear weapons go off, the whole world doesn't truly die, but a nuclear winter would basically be like a mini ice age. Most of the crops won't grow. Probably 80 to 90% of the world population would die off from starvation.
Yeah. I thought that nuclear world is like, it's like a big bomb.
No,
Huge
nuclear wars,
bomb.
everyone throwing nuclear weapons at each other, but it throws up so much debris and dust into the air that it blocks out the sun. And what ends up happening is that this creates an issue where not enough heat gets onto the planet, and radioactive fallout falls everywhere, so it's toxic. So you get that plus all the snow, and this toxic snow basically comes down. However, this is kind of hard to explain to people. Most of our nuclear weapons now, especially our fusion bombs, this sounds kind of asinine to say, are cleaner when they detonate. They use more of the fuel when they detonate, so it doesn't leave as much fallout. However, they're far more destructive, and they destroy a lot more things. That alone will create a dust cloud. So there's still going to be some fallout compared to the old bombs we used to have, but you're still going to get a nuclear winter where basically, I think the last estimate was like we'd have 7 years of nuclear winter minimum. So
7?
Yeah, imagine 7 years of nonstop winter.
So it won't be a bomb.
It'll be bombs going off everywhere in all the major cities, and all the fallout and debris blocks out the sun, and then basically we get a worldwide cooling effect, and then rain turns to snow. Most of the world starts to freeze. All the crops die off. There's not enough sunlight. It's just terrible.
Where did you take this knowledge?
Both the Soviet Union, the United States, and France and Great Britain did studies on mass fallout using basically small-scale experiments, and they all did the same thing with nuclear fallout and nuclear winter. So both sides figured out the same thing, and that's why we just did the mutually assured destruction. Like, I won't do it if you don't do it mentality. because neither side wins. However, in the 60s, well actually the 50s, one of the 60s, both sides did try to make up plans to build huge underground bunkers and facilities where maybe that they can have part of their population live out those years and then come back to reclaim the planet, so to speak, which is ridiculous. There's no way in hell we could do it, especially with the technology back then. And they eventually, both sides eventually abandoned it, and they just used those facilities to store weapons and do other testing there.
So, talking about Russia and Ukraine, what do you think will happen next? In the end, maybe?
Honestly, as much as Ukraine's fighting their best right now, I don't see them winning the war. As much as they want to, the best they can do is make Russia win a Pyrrhic victory. That's a term where Russia wins, but at tremendous cost. And the reason why that they were pushed for that is, sure, Russia wins, but they'll spend more than a decade or two recuperating the losses from it, both financially and manpower and resources.
For sure.
But
what do you think Ukraine join to NATO?
even if they join, but here's the problem. All the member states of NATO, technically they're supposed to agree for them to join, although there's been exceptions. At least the majority have to vote them in. However, certain member states of NATO have more power than others. And as it stands right now, out of fear that a major war breaking out into Western Europe, Germany and France initially have vetoed allowing Ukraine to join NATO.
Why?
Because they're worried about a major war breaking out between Russia and Western Europe.
Oh, they worried about this?
Yeah, because the only nation that really has a true standing army that could do anything, well actually the only two nations inside Europe that could really manpower-wise slow the Russians is France and Poland. Germany dismantled most of their army. They're basically almost, they're kind of sad and pathetic how small they are now. Britain has downsized theirs multiple times, and they're across the English Channel. They'd have to move their troops over. So it's really, besides England and the United States, it's really France and Poland are the main two that actually have ground troops. And the issue with France is half of them are conscripts. They have mandatory service for certain parts of them.
And also we're talking about North Korea, and I was wondering how people are living there. It's crazy. We started this conversation from the conversation about not Soviet Union, about communism, right?
Yeah.
You said that North Korea has communism now.
Yes.
What does this suggest? What it means?
What does it mean?
Yeah. For people who living there, like.
So
they're
with
not
communism,
equal.
the state owns everything. That's really what it stands for. The communism is that everything is state controlled, state owned, and it's supposed to be equally distributed amongst everyone based on their labor, but that's not what happens. There's the haves and the have-nots. Those who are in power have everything, those who are not have almost nothing. It's like that with every communist nation. It always has been, because
how was in Soviet Union?
Yeah, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So those in power allow themselves to be, they take all the power and keep everything for themselves.
But why they think that their president or God?
Because they're brainwashed since they're little children to be told all these things since they're like 2 to 3 years old, through propaganda, their schools, until they grow up. And They make them live in terror and fear their entire lives.
And who refused to believe in that, what they did with
They
that?
put them in camps and kill them.
Oh my God.
Or they
kill them.
escape and run to South Korea.
Oh God.
Most of the people who escape are actually soldiers because they're the ones who are usually stationed near the demilitarized zone.
So it was possible to
Yeah,
escape?
most of them who escape are North Korean troops.
Yeah.
What they do is basically they're supposed to patrol the zone between North and South Korea. They'll run over and throw down their weapon and say, I want to leave. And South Korea has a thing where they'll accept any defector. So a lot of the defectors, the North Korean troops will shoot at the other troops trying to defect. They'll try to kill them if they're defecting. So they usually would defect in a group, like the whole group going up, like, hey, they'll sneak into it and then they'll all defect at the same time so nobody can shoot them.
Yeah.
And they'll run over the border, give up their weapons, be taken into custody, and eventually they'll just stay in South Korea and want to be free.
We just want to get out of this crazy communism country.
But not all of them are soldiers. Some are civilians who either through family who have members in the North Korean government or they're just really lucky. A couple of them have escaped going into China, and then from China escaping that way because there's a couple of organizations that hide in China to help get them out. Because even the Chinese think it's ridiculous, but the Chinese have to be very quiet because their own government supports North Korea, so they have to be quiet how they talk about it.
China supports North Korea or North Korea?
Yeah, China supports North Korea. They consider them an ally, but they consider them an evil, but a necessary evil. They don't like half of the things that they do, but so long as that they are a buffer state, they let them do what they want.
So China has like a buffer state, North Korea?
Yes.
From America?
Yes.
But China also is a friend of Russia. Russia and China against America.
Yes. However, China and Russia are
smart.
No, they're basically Hitler and Stalin. There's at some point or another they're going to turn on each other. Just like Hitler and Stalin were best buddies at first, and then they turned on each other.
Yeah.
That's exactly what will happen with China and Russia eventually. Except,
wow, you're comparing.
Yeah, unfortunately for them, what they don't understand is that Xi Jinping is exactly like Adolf Hitler. He is waiting. He wants Russia's resources, just like Germany wanted Russia's resources. Eventually, he's going to turn on Russia.
Who wants Russian resources?
Xi Jinping, the Chinese president.
Oh.
The reason why he's having their troops train with the Russians and learn better tank tactics is because eventually he wants to invade Russia to take the coal and oil in Russian fields and their iron. Because if he can actually take that, he doesn't need the sea lanes for his oil anymore. It would be much harder to take him out in a war.
Yeah, and when he's supposed to attack America?
No, at that point he'll just say, "Come fight me. I can close off my sea lanes.
Yes.
I don't need them anymore."
I can protect myself.
Yes, that's exactly the thing.
No, because I have everything. And Russia too. Russia becomes China.
And the truth, the joke that a few buddies and I made was that Russia's best call when Ukraine wanted to join NATO, what they could have done, which would have been much better, is Russia comes in and says, "Okay, we want a NATO as well. If Ukraine joins, you have to let us join too. That way you can't attack us."
Yeah.
Because if they had called their bluff on that, if Putin was intelligent, he would have gone for that play, because then he could be on good terms with China and NATO. So if China ever stabbed him in the back, all of NATO has to support Russia in the invasion, which means all of Europe, the United States, everyone has to come to Russia's aid. He would have gotten all the trade benefits of trading with China and India, and he would have been able to be part of NATO. It would have been a win-win. But he wanted a buffer state instead.
And he become unstoppable.
Yeah, he was stubborn and didn't want to think that through, because he was afraid that if Ukraine and Russia joined NATO, that means the United States would control Russia, but it's not the case. We don't control Europe at all. We get in arguments with Europe all the time over what we're supposed to do with NATO. we've had huge issues. They're not spending enough money for their agreements to support NATO, and they just go, oh, we'll do whatever we want. What are you going to do about it? Same thing happens all the time.
I'm so happy to have a conversation with the smartest man in the world.
Thank you, babe.
Thank you, baby.